There's a heavily overused movie cliche where the geeky character reveals himself as such by saying something like, "Of course, a lot of people forget that Frankenstein was the name of the doctor, not the monster." In actuality, not many people forget that at all, because it's such a heavily overused movie trope. A better test to assess potential literati is to ask people where Frankenstein begins. If they describe a Victorian laboratory full of alchemical instruments, you know that their knowledge isn't as full as they might have you believe. Frankenstein begins in the Arctic.
The second thing which bamboozles fans of the movie genealogy is that the book is written as a frame narrative, which is to say with another story wrapped around it, in this case the life of an explorer named Robert Walton. Walton is a failed writer, a scientist, and a man desperate for fame. He has set out on an expedition to the North Pole during which his crew rescue someone, described as a body dreadfully emaciated by fatigue and suffering, who is of course Victor Frankenstein. The book is written as an epistolary, i.e. a novel written as other documents, in this case letters home from Walton to his sister. Now there are a couple of excellent reasons for writing a book this way, but before we get into them, it's worth noting that if you prefer the film technique of jumping into a more juicy part of the action, then your thinking is completely in line with Mary Shelley's original idea. The novel started its life as a short story, and the original beginning, "It was on a dreary night in November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils," is basically the moment at which the monster comes alive.
Frankenstein was written as Mary Shelley's entry into a short story writing competition proposed by Byron during a mutual stay in a lodge in Geneva. Just for a moment, picture the scene. Apparently it was a dark and genuinely stormy night, and Mary Shelley had been terrified the night before by Byron, Percy and Byron's doctor Polidori's scientific discussion, which had discussed such things as Galvani's Italian experiments into animating corpses, frog corpses, but nevertheless, using electricity, and the works of Erasmus Darwin, who'd noticed single-cell organisms spontaneously come to life from nothing. It's important to remember that Mary Shelley was still just 18 years old, having eloped with the still married to someone else, Percy Shelley, aged just 16. Byron was a terrifying enough figure in his own right, and Polidori was apparently hardly subtle in his amorous attentions towards Mary. After Byron's suggestion, Mary Shelley penned an idea that came to her in a nightmare, a story to mock the creator of the world, and from this cautionary tale came Frankenstein.
By writing the novel from 3 different perspectives, Mary Shelley is able to layer those perspectives on top of one another, which gives a significant amount of narrative richness. Note too the ideological positioning. One is rich, one is poor, one is of high status, one is of low status, which gives a nice contrast. But by having all 3 as a type of explorer, she maintains plot coherence. This one might seem a little unlikely. After all, the experiments that Mary Shelley had heard about the night before represented the very latest in scientific thinking. And her book basically created its own new genre, Gothic horror. However, it's fair to say that the concepts behind a lot of what she was writing, alchemy, communication with the dead, the existence of a soul, or vital principle as it was known in Victorian England, had been heavily explored quite recently and may even have been considered a little bit passé. No, it was exploration that was thrilling British society. Napoleon's recent defeat had opened the oceans again for the first time in nearly 20 years. And glory-seeking expeditions were numerous. Unlike many literary works, Frankenstein is a novel where the imagery should pretty much jump out at you. The loneliness and isolation of the Arctic tundra is an obvious reference to Frankenstein's character. The arrogance and selfishness of the other 2 main protagonists, an allusion to the level of knowledge to which an ordinary mortal should attain. and the biblical references should jump out of the page at you. Neither Mary nor Percy were believers in the understated approach to allegory, and even the less obvious imagery is far from subtle. For example, modern-day readers might not have heard of Ingolstadt University, which is where Victor Frankenstein has trained, but in the 1800s it was known for unorthodox religionism and the presence of the Illuminati. Then there are the three youths associated with the de Lacy family, whose names are Felix, Agatha and Sapphy, which respectively mean happiness, goodness and purity. Note too that neither Mary nor Percy were above a certain amount of intellectual showing off. Felix is Latin, Agatha is Greek and Sapphy is Arabic.
The three main characters in Frankenstein are all male. Women, when they appear at all, are idealised, submissive and frequently disposable. Can this really be the work of Mary Shelley, whose father was an outspoken social critic who believed marriage an outdated institution and whose mother was a passionate advocate for the rights of women? Well, firstly, it's worth remembering that the novel is written by a woman. Therefore, whatever gender she chooses her characters to be are rather incidental. To produce in the early 1800s a work the scope of which is so broad, a work which considers science, comparative theology, literature, sociology, philosophy, history, is itself an eloquent statement on the intellect of woman. Of course, the book was originally published anonymously, but that was more to do with Mary Shelley's known radicalist leanings than her gender. Secondly, I would argue that by idealising those characteristics we mentioned earlier, we are in fact lauding them, not downplaying them. Kindness, sensitivity, altruism, there is little weakness in those characteristics. Compared to the hyper-masculine qualities of Victor and Robert, they seem far more impressive, indicative of a cooperative and progressive society, as opposed to the destructive impulses of the men. Mary Shelley was an intellectual. Percy Shelley, to whom she passed the manuscript for some fairly heavy editing, was arguably an even greater intellectual. Consequently, if you are looking to do deeper analysis on this work, you basically just have to pick anything that was relevant in Victorian society amongst intellectuals at the time. Psychoanalysis was new, and the concept of Oedipus, i.e. whether or not Victor Frankenstein was attempting to replace his mother by creating a child, parenting generally, social theory, social engineering, the ability to create a better society, the ability to better oneself through education, as prevalent in Lockean philosophy. All of these topics are relevant and available, but if you want my opinion, you won't overthink it too much. Thanks very much. Goodbye.